Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Andrew Orlowski. Make sure to subscribe here, wherever you get your podcasts, and at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews. Now, today's show, we're going to be talking about the video from Lebanon that continues to shock the world, which captured in real time Tuesday as a coordinated attack on pagers used by Hezbollah exploded en masse at the same time, injuring nearly 3,000 people and killing at least 12, including a child. Images showed people at markets, for example, suddenly under attack from their own device or a nearby customer's device, as, for example, they browsed fruit. On Wednesday, a second wave of attacks reportedly targeted two-way pagers and even mobile phones. More video continued pouring in from Beirut, just as shocking as the video from the day before. A New York Times report sourced to people briefed on the matter put it this way: Israel carried out its operation against Hezbollah on Tuesday by hiding explosive material within a new batch of Taiwanese-made pagers imported into Lebanon, according to American and other officials briefed on the operation. The Times continued, the pagers which Hezbollah had ordered from Gold Apollo in Taiwan had been tampered with before they reached Lebanon, according to some of the officials. Most were the company's AR-924 model, though 3 other Gold Apollo models were also included in the shipment. At first blush, this may seem like an escalation only in the region's ongoing conflict since Israel was attacked by Hamas on October 7th of last year. Significant as that is, because it was an escalation, this is also an escalation with even more frightening ramifications, and the underlying issue has everything to do with our supply chains. In the Times report I just cited, we learned that officials believed the pagers were, quote, tampered with before they even reached Lebanon. Hezbollah apparently ordered the pagers from a Taiwanese company, but the Taiwanese company is saying the pagers were made by a company based in Hungary as part of a branding deal. Now, the Hungarian government, meanwhile, is saying authorities have confirmed that the company in question is a trading intermediary with no manufacturing or operational site in Hungary. It is one manager registered at its declared address, and the reference devices have never been in Hungary. That's according, again, to the Hungarian government. So at some point in the supply chain, Israel managed to hide these, quote, tiny explosives, as the Times described them, in hundreds of pagers and radios used by an adversary. The implications of that apparent fact are terrifying for all of us, from the Middle East to right here in the US. Andrew Orlowski argues in Unheard that we are incredibly vulnerable in very mundane ways because of our numbness to rapid globalization. He joins us now to explain why we should all be concerned about this. Andrew, thank you for joining us. Andrew, now we're learning that in addition to the pager attack on Tuesday, there's also an attack on personal radios. And I just want to start off here by asking you, what do we know now about how Israel might have pulled off both of these attacks? Because that seems to have a fascinating backstory.
It's a very audacious attack that probably wouldn't have been possible or would have been much more difficult 50 years ago when industrial equipment and telecommunications equipment was just made by a small handful of companies. Thanks to globalization and liberalization, it's now hundreds, and we have very deep and long supply chains that are much more vulnerable and represent much more of a risk surface.
You've written specifically about vertical integration and that effect on national security. It's often talked about purely in economic terms, but there's a massive national security concern that relates not only to Israel, but countries all over the world for obvious reasons. So could you get into that a little bit?
The supply chains are now very long, so nobody knows what they're doing. I was very struck by the quote from the Taiwanese manufacturer, whose brand appears on the pages that exploded, saying that he hadn't actually made them. He'd simply licensed the brand to an operation in Hungary. Now, Korea has maintained its huge vertically integrated companies like Samsung, like LG, that make the components for a part and the part itself, and then they retail it. But for very good reasons, markets demanded that companies unlock value, divest, make divestments, and then there's another parallel trend of offshoring. So there's lots of unknowns in the equation, and Israel was able to take advantage of that. The nature of that supply chain made it very open to attack and made that attack by Israeli intelligence possible. But it also affects cars, it affects telephony, it affects almost every part of modern technological life. We've created enormous vulnerabilities here.
Right, and I suspect the rest of our conversation might actually frighten people because it frightens me to think about. Andrew, can you drill down specifically on the SolarWinds example? Because we had a conversation somewhat along these same lines when the SolarWinds situation unfolded. How does that illustrate maybe a similar problem facing a lot of different parts of the economy and honestly public life?
Yeah, these are fascinating because Microsoft allowed a third party it's actually a third party security company, rather like CrowdStrike, access to the systems and then simply didn't notice that it had actually failed to keep its certificates up to date. So it actually failed to do basic security hygiene, which meant that part of the system was very open. I mean, these are carefully engineered attacks with lots of different techniques used. There's an extraordinary one was revealed earlier this year. And that's a system that's rolled out thousands of times a day. This targeted a volunteer, a very lonely man in Montana, who was the key maintainer of an open source project. It was the zip library that everybody uses. And he was cuckooed effectively. They played on his mental health issues, took over the project. These are people who nobody has ever met, and then installed a backdoor in it. And we'd always been told that open source software has lots of eyes on it. It was kind of open science in practice. But that turned out not to be the case. There are entire parts of our technological machine that nobody ever really looks at or inspects.
You mentioned cars just one moment ago, one of the most frightening examples. Could you tell us a little bit about what the possibilities might be when it comes to how cars could be infiltrated or how cars could be affected by potential national security concerns?
Well, they already are in a way, and that's a good way to think about it, through thieves. Thieves can use wireless devices to remotely walk past the car and then pop the lights off and steal it. And that shouldn't be possible through the security method, but it is. Security experts have been warning for years not to attach the thing to the internet. And that's, of course, created this great vulnerability of when a light bulb or a security camera is attached to the internet, often with a default password, you don't really know who's attacking it. Now, our state, the UK, has actually been pretty good, our deep state, in trying to secure these, and it's actually got its standards to be adopted globally and in the EU, even though we've left the EU. But cars represent a particular problem because obviously you'd want to crash a car with a high-value target inside it. But you can simply do a lot of economic damage simply by inhibiting their speed. So if the morning rush hour to London every car was capped to 15 miles an hour, the gridlock would take many, many hours to unlock. So you can do kind of low-level damage as well as high-level damage there.
That is such a fascinating possibility because it is so small, but the ripple effect would be so incredibly consequential. Are there areas other than cars? I mean, we've talked about planes, other things. The grid, I imagine.
Well, don't forget, food relies on trucks almost completely for getting the stuff to our supermarkets.
Ambulances.
Yeah, ambulances, emergency services. I mean, I think we're starting to wake up to the threat. We've almost been asleep for so long with globalization, and we assumed China was just this benevolent factory that we could just send orders to and it would come back. I mean, there are other ways that China's industrial effort is being weaponized against us. Somebody said to me last week, unless we have manufacturing, we don't have a defense sector. We literally can't make the materials that we need to keep us safe. So I think we're just at the start of. We're at the end of one chapter, but the start of another where we really must decide what we make in secure countries like the ANZUS submarine agreement, for example, and what we allow to be made in offshore, essentially.
COVID was supposedly the wake-up call. We had however many discussions about this in media in the early days of COVID about how vulnerable our supply chains were, pharmaceuticals. A lot of Western countries were terrified to find out how vulnerable those supply chains of pharmaceuticals, drugs, those things were.
That's right.
Why wasn't COVID the wake-up call that it seems we were all so convinced it was, at least momentarily?
I think it's a really good question, and I think the administrative class and the political class just loves going back to sleep again. There's almost nothing it can't kick down the road for somebody else to deal with in the future. I mean, we got lucky in the sense that pharmaceutical manufacturing has still not completely been outsourced to other countries. We have to do it here. And there are some quite tough choices ahead. I mean, we don't need to make everything in the UK or in an adjacent safe country. things would be very expensive then. But we have to kind of find a balance where we're not quite so vulnerable on poorly made technological systems that we don't really know anything about.
For example, that we would have the capacity to have enough masks in the case of an emergency, something like that for doctors or anything like that.
I mean, every single testing kit that we used for many, many months was sourced in China. And I thought this was very peculiar that we didn't even have the capacity to generate this stuff, even in Europe.
There's a raging debate right now about, and it's about Nippon Steel, which is a Japanese company that wants to acquire one of the big steel makers here in the US, and it's being talked about almost entirely in economic terms, as though this is a question of industrial policy. And it's a question of an industrial policy where the government is putting its thumb on the scale of the free market and, making this decision to prolong the economic pain of steelmaking communities that are probably going to suffer the long-term consequences anyway. But it's hardly being discussed in national security terms. You're seeing some national security experts raise alarms about it. But it seems to me, Andrew, there's so many areas of the economies in the US and the UK that are affected by this, and we're just kind of sleepwalking past the problems.
Yeah, I think national security is an exception to the dogma that the government should interfere. And that, I say dogma, but it's something I'm quite sympathetic to, because every time you have an industrial policy, somebody will pop up who doesn't really deserve the money. That just goes with the territory. But I find these debates, particularly in London-centric debates about industrial policy, quite bizarre, because every country is intervening and picking winners. The US defense sector is entirely the government picking winners. Every country has to start thinking about national interest. And I think this has been the big spoke in globalization. It's not just the effect on communities, but the fact that we can't really trust and we can't really defend ourselves at the end of the day if we're not producing and manufacturing high-tech equipment.
The Steve Bannons of the world would probably argue, and I don't want to put words in Steve Bannon's mouth because he can't speak for himself since he is currently in prison, but I think he would look at this and he would say this was the result of Western elites sucking out of the economy all of the profits they possibly could, even at the expense of national security. It's not purely myopia. It's also sort of a self-seeking, or it's a factor or function of the self-seeking motivations on behalf of Western elites. What do you make of that? How much of this could have been driven by people just sort of making lots of money in China? I mean, Hunter Biden made lots of money through deals with Chinese folks, Chinese businesses. What part of it might have anything to do with just a lot of people were making a lot of money, which made it easier to justify?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the lobbying around the export of semiconductors, the American industry has never liked sanctions. It wants to sell as much as it can. To somebody like Steve Bannon, they're effectively traitors. They're the least patriotic sort of sector there is. It just wants to sell into China because it's an enormous market. Apple apparently has not had a TV show critical of China since it started Apple TV. I think we can guess why that is. But there's another factor. I don't think Bannon's picked up on it. But we are because of net zero, we're deindustrializing very, very rapidly. Yeah. I don't see any other path to growth for a country like the UK, which is still very innovative, has a lot of high quality engineers, and is very good at that particular part of the chain where between the invention and productization of a high tech product, it's really good at it. Medical devices, for example, gyroscopes for satellites, we do a lot of this really well. Is that net zero will simply kick away the capacity to do that. A lot of the high-tech innovation needs to be near some kind of manufacturing facility, and manufacturing is going because of high energy prices. America will be all right, I think. Even Democrats have no shame in digging up hydrocarbons, which they need to keep industry and the pharmaceuticals and farming going, because we're a hydrocarbon world. But Europe has got this terrible kind of fit of virtue signaling, where diplomats and administrators signal to other diplomats and administrators how virtuous they are, while all the domestic industries close.
The net zero conversation is happening totally divorced from the context of national security. And that's another thing. I'm wondering what your take on this is, Andrew. Is it the culture war that is distracting us from this deeper conversation about national security? Why do we talk about net zero policies so rarely in the context of how they might actually have life and death consequences on a geopolitical scale?
Well, I've got a theory about this, which some readers subscribe to, and I can attest to it, which is that the kind of the British ruling class doesn't like engineering or manufacturing. But 70 years ago, it would need somebody in the room who understood this, who understood what was feasible and what wasn't feasible, whether the bridge would fall down, which is a metaphor that Kemi Badenoch used when she launched her leadership a couple of weeks ago. But now it lives in this kind of fantasy world or dream world where it doesn't really know where food comes from. It doesn't know how the modern world works. It doesn't understand that pharmaceuticals need fertilizers, need hydrocarbon. It doesn't think, it thinks it can be in a hydrocarbon world but abolish the hydrocarbons. But even if you take a fraction of those away, you've got an enormous economic cost, enormous pain, and you need to invent very, very good substitutes, which we haven't really done yet. So I think it's really the ruling class has just lacks those kind of basic empirical skills of an engineer or a scientist or a mathematician would bring to the table. And I know a scientist theocracy, as Eisenhower warned, has its own problems, but we just don't seem to have rational people in the room when it comes to so many of these areas, innovation, where wealth creation actually comes from. So the conversations are sort of hyper real. They're conducted on this sort of rarefied strata that only a policy elite can take part in, and those debates conclusions are completely irrelevant. They're nonsense.
One person who totally confounds the usual kind of culture war divide is Elon Musk, but he's someone who's also contributed mightily via Tesla and our government via a lot of subsidies to Tesla to this problem of cars in particular. And I bring this up after talking about net zero, because this was originally framed by Musk and others as exactly the kind of the contribution to getting to goals like net zero and getting off of oil dependence for the sake of the economy, for the sake of the environment, for the sake of national security. And yet Teslas seem to me, and I'm curious for your take on this, Andrew, not just Teslas, but other electric vehicles, incredibly vulnerable to exactly the kinds of potential hacking and manipulation that you just mentioned. How do we explain Elon Musk in this dilemma? I don't know that I've ever really heard Elon Musk talk at length about this.
Modern cars are effectively smartphones on wheels, again with electronics, often very, very cheap. The margins in the auto industry are very low, and the build quality and kit out of a Tesla is even lower because the batteries are proportionately more of the cost. They're quite cheap cars internally. If I take that part first, Tesla has kind of made us more vulnerable to influence by a hostile outside actor. These cars are full of software vulnerabilities, and I think I can't really speak of it, but we are going to see some involving Tesla quite shortly. When it comes to his status, well, he's admired as a manufacturer. The state also uses him to promote these lifestyles and products which it wants to see the rest of us adopt. But then China's kind of got there first. It's making much cheaper electric cars, just as good as his, and governments have this dilemma of whether to block them and keep the prices high for their own consumers, or whether to let these slightly iffy and whether to expose, I think what the security people call it, they widen the attack vector for a hostile state when you've got lots of Chinese EVs.
How quickly could we or should we expect this to escalate? Because again, this is not something people think about on a daily basis, despite the fact that it is sort of undergirding everything, the fabric of life in countries all over the world. It is totally vulnerable, and it is fragile, and it is at risk every single day, though we don't think about it. This forces us to think about it. It forces us to see the images of people at markets in Lebanon and suddenly being dead or being maimed or being blinded. So is this a significant escalation in our sort of lurch towards that kind of cyber warfare and terrorism? How quickly could this really start to roll down the hill, the snowball start to roll down the hill and escalate into a dominant part of war going forward?
Well, I think it's an extraordinary image, isn't it? Which is that you've got these 90s anachronistic devices being turned into weapons. It's really something that if you proposed it as a plot of a thriller, people wouldn't really believe. And I know this has been the staple of fiction before. If the question is how do we start to think about making our world more resilient and secure, that's a very long process. I mean, we have taken steps to secure consumer IoT devices, for example. But the dominant kind of ideology is that we shouldn't have our own industrial policy almost, and we shouldn't, we should still be quite trusting. I mean, I just think the elites have got a long way to go to think of that. The most alarming development this year is actually something that was revealed at the Black Hat conferences this year in Las Vegas in August, which is, again, thanks to Microsoft, companies are exposing an enormous amount of private data to the world at large through AI chatbots. They simply blow through all the barriers, all the holes, all the security. You can tap into hundreds or thousands of corporate chatbots, interrogate them, and find the most extraordinary things that you would have had to do complex social engineering to achieve. I would simply have a complete moratorium on corporate AI until we get a handle on this. It's not the AI that's going to kill us; it's the deployment of it, which is of a really poor product. That punches through norms and practices and actual, physical software barriers. That's the problem there.
Great. Well, Andrew, I say great sarcastically because it's all just so great. I feel so safe. But thank you so much for your time and for your fascinating and important insight here.
Thanks very much for having me.
My apologies if that was a little bit terrifying. It's frightening to me as well, but such an important issue that gets such short shrift. Again, sometimes I say this is the definition of an undercurrent. This is the definition of an undercurrent because it is literally the undercurrent of our social fabric, of our technical systems, of our infrastructure that is vulnerable here in this case. So my thanks to Andrew Orlowski for joining us. Thank you to you for watching. Make sure to subscribe here at the Undercurrents channel. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're releasing this every single day on audio format as well, if that's where you like to listen. And go ahead and subscribe over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience. We have an episode up this week that is only for premium subscribers. So if you want to watch that, go ahead, go over to undercurrents.tv. We will be back here tomorrow with more Undercurrents. Thanks for tuning in.